Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Improving Outcomes for Students in Rural Areas, the Promise and Challenge of Educator Networks. My name is Nettie Legters. I'm a practice expert in dropout prevention and secondary school improvement with REL Northwest, and it is really my pleasure to be facilitating today's webinar. This is a webinar of REL Northwest, the Regional Education Laboratory, and our goal and why we do webinars like this is to really get research and information off the shelf, and I guess you could say out of the cloud these days, and help make sure that it's put into action. And we do this by deepening collaboration and evidence use among educators and policymakers on important educational issues identified by our regional stakeholders, like today's topic on improving teaching and learning in rural areas. REL Northwest is one of 10 regional education laboratories, or RELs, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and we partner with stakeholders in 5 states, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Now, during this webinar, we're going to begin with some introductions, and then I'm going to just briefly frame the presentations, drawing on some research about challenges in rural education and about educator networks as a promising response to those challenges. After that, our speakers are going to present on each of their educator networks. And after each presentation, we'll have a short question-answer period, and then there'll be a little bit more time, we hope, for questions and final comments before we close. All right, I'm really excited about our lineup of speakers today. All of these folks are seasoned professionals who've dedicated many of their waking hours to improving outcomes for students, particularly in rural areas. First up, we have Danette Parsley, who's Education Northwest Chief Program Officer and project lead of the Northwest Rural Innovation and Student Engagement Network, fondly known as Northwest RISE. To Danette's presentation and providing a practitioner's perspective as a Northwest RISE member and steering committee member is Karen Martin, who's a teacher in Denali Borough School District in Healy, Alaska. Next, we have Margaret McLean, who directs the long-standing Vermont Rural Partnership, and then Brad Mitchell, who's the managing director of Battelle for Kids. He's going to wrap up the session by telling us about the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative. So let's take a quick look at our session goals. What we want for you all to leave this session today, after having heard these wonderful presentations from really seasoned professionals who've dedicated most of their waking hours to improving education for students in rural areas. And after that rich meal, we hope that you will leave having learned about some common challenges to educating children and youth in rural school systems, that you've increased your understanding of education networks as a strategy to improve rural education, particularly related to college and career readiness, and finally, having explored some strengths and challenges of a network approach to improving education in rural areas. So I'm going to go ahead and get started just by setting the table a little bit with some research on this topic. You know, so much media has been focused on education issues in urban areas that I think we've lost sight of the fact that more than 40% of all schools and nearly half of all school districts are in rural areas, and close to a third of all students across the country attend schools in rural areas. It's also important to recognize that that educators in rural areas are facing challenges similar to their urban counterparts, and in particular challenge is educating students in poverty. Nationally, a full quarter of rural students live in poverty, and it's not uncommon as our presenters have experienced, for child poverty to exceed 50% in rural areas across the U.S. Many of you all understand that the resource-based nature of the economies in rural areas make rural areas really historically prone to the sort of boom-bust cycles that have made it very difficult to build wealth and thrive over time. In some places, the school system has been the most stable employer and institution. Demographics of rural areas have also been changing. Rural educators are experiencing an influx of students, the vast majority of whom are students of color, who may have recently arrived in this country and for whom English may be a second or even a third language. So a lot of folks in our virtual room have experience studying and practicing rural education. So I'm hoping that we can take a minute to get your input on what you think are some of the biggest challenges or hurdles for rural educators who are working under and adapting to some of the conditions I just described. This is your chance to share with our presenters some of the challenges that you're most concerned about and what you would most like to see change. So I invite you right now to use the chat panel, look for that speech bubble up and to the right of your slide, and enter your response and send it to all participants. So we'll take a minute to review that. All right, see, isolation, professional development, in some places declining enrollment, certainly lack of funding, legislation that really focuses only on urban and suburban areas, having peers to collaborate with and brainstorm with, retaining educators in rural areas, lots of turnover, and interesting parent expectations of schools, or from schools, yep. And, yep, access and quality professional development. Okay, good. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, because I think what you all will recognize is pretty much everything in the literature is what you all have been recording in the chat and sharing in the chat as your concerns. The things that really stand out in the literature are the poor infrastructure, difficulty also with unreliable or inadequate internet access has been a big thing lately. Human capital shortage, and also people really needing to wear a lot of different hats. So the principal, for example, may also be the bus driver and the facilities manager, and everybody's pitching in the lunchroom, and the counselor may be there 1 or 2 days a week, and otherwise everyone else is supporting students for both academic and non-academic issues. And few opportunities for professional development and collaboration. I was at a conference a few years ago that was focused on rural education, and I attended this riveting panel of 3 superintendents who were talking about their challenges and solutions. And one of the superintendents got some very rueful laughs from the audience when he described a struggle to apply training on professional learning communities, the state-led training, in his district, because so many teachers were the only ones teaching in a particular grade or subject area. And his teachers would joke about being a PLC of one. All right. So the question of the hour, and for the remainder of this webinar, is really what needs to happen for rural schools and students to thrive. And we're going to focus this webinar on a particular response, education change networks or collaboratives, and we're going to probably use those terms interchangeably for today. And informing this webinar is a substantial and really growing body of international research that indicates that education change networks, when they are properly implemented, developed, and led, can improve student achievement. And those networks have produced gains not only in the developed world, but there are studies also of effects in underfunded rural regions in Colombia and Mexico, for example. But there's really been very little research on rural education networks or collaboratives in the United States. And a couple of years ago, Brad Mitchell, who is on our webinar today, and we're going to hear from in a second, reached out to Education Northwest, where REL Northwest is based, to begin to kind of address that gap, to really explore rural education networks or collaboratives in the U.S. And I was the lucky researcher who got to work with him on this project. And we started out by developing a kind of working definition of rural education collaboratives that you can see on this slide. So 2 or more rural school districts with a shared commitment and common purpose, collaboratives that are visible, active, and organized, and that are really focusing on improving practice by pursuing real solutions and have outcomes and metrics that are, at least stated, and probably most importantly, a peer-to-peer learning network, not just a service organization, but an organization that really promotes both job-embedded professional development and peer-to-peer development support. So we began investigating the status of rural education networks in the U.S., and we started with a national field scan to kind of determine how many of them are out there. Where are they? What do they do? How are they organized? And what outcomes are they reporting? And the scan, so what we found, as you can see on this map, is about 17 rural collaboratives in 16 states that were visible and active, established, and again, most importantly, focused on improving practice. Okay. We interviewed some directors of those organizations and identified some common activities that they're all engaged in. Previous slide. For example, these collaboratives were sharing resources to achieve economies of scale and access to contracts through pooled purchasing. They were also engaged in advocacy, making voices of rural educators louder in state and federal politics, and developing engaging, relevant curriculum and scaling best programs and practices, and lots of focus on preparing students for college and career. Okay. So in addition to the field scan, we also decided to take a deeper dive into a handful of these collaboratives to learn more about how they started up and how they've changed and been sustained over time. And all of this we wrote up into a report called Generating Opportunity and Prosperity, the Promise of Rural Education Collaboratives, that was published by Battelle for Kids. And we are really delighted to have leaders of 3 of these 4 networks here today to share their work with you and to go a little bit deeper into their work and some of your questions. All right. So before I pass this on to Danette and Karen, I want to check in with Margaret McLean. Are you there? Can you hear us? Okay. We'll come back to Margaret when we get to her presentation. So at this time, Really delighted to pass this on to Danette Parsley and Karen Martin to talk about Northwest RISE.
Great, thanks, Nettie. I'm delighted to kick us off here to talk a little bit about Northwest RISE, and then I will pass it to Karen, my colleague, who will breathe additional life into the work of the network. So Northwest RISE, here's a little bit about us. We are a network. I saw lots of you putting in the chat box one of the conditions or challenges or whatnot of rural schools is often you have singletons or one teacher per grade level or subject area, and Northwest RISE was specifically designed for that size district where teachers are alone. And so our 32 rural districts are all 400 students or less, and they average about 200 students in the district. We cover 4 states in the Pacific Northwest. Actually, if you'll stay on the other side, that would be great. So we have Alaska, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon as our sites that we'll show you on a map here in just a second. Our focus is really twofold. One is for the adults who are networking, who we are connecting through the network, it is to hone educator practice. So to come together, have colleagues to collaborate with, work with, troubleshoot with, push each other, challenge each other, et cetera, and to grow together. Then the second part of that, of course, is it's for the purpose of increasing student engagement and achievement. And something that's really important to our network is that we didn't want to set the student level goal as simply achievement, meaning kind of test scores or academic achievement in a more limited way. That is, of course, very important to us. But we really zeroed in on student engagement. That's why it's in the title of our network, to encompass things like attachment to community, their academic achievement, and their students' ability to kind of have the maximum life choices after high school. So that's really our focus. We carry out the activities of the network. We use a combination of in-person and distance networking. So we meet together in person 2 days, twice a year in June and November, where everyone from those 4 states comes together, a group at least of teachers and administrators from each of the sites. And that whole time that we're working together is designed as working sessions, collaborative sessions, some of it in what we call job-alike groups, which is really the cornerstone of our network is teachers working with teachers, principals working with principals, at, again, kind of a grade level or subject area PLC. So second grade teachers working with second grade teachers, secondary math with secondary math, et cetera. In between sessions, people are hard at work, again, mostly in those job-alike groups, carrying out projects that they design together that are important to them to help them kind of further their practice and, again, increase student engagement in their classrooms. They're carrying out their projects and they're sort of connecting with each other virtually, whether it's via WebEx or Skype or phone or text or whatever they come to an agreement about that works for them. We also have touch points as a whole network when they're kind of learning needs of the group at large. So we'll invite speakers and that kind of thing to work with us virtually. The online platform that we use is Schoology. So we do have a common platform where we save our resources and we can chat with each other and that kind of stuff. The final part that I wanted to talk about in relation to our network is leadership. This is really important to us. It was designed to be a member-led network, and it's really evolved into that, and we're really proud of that. It's a grassroots initiative as opposed to something that came out of a funding stream, for example, where we constructed a project to meet that funding stream need. This is really member-led. We lead it through a steering committee, so 4 representatives, teachers, administrators, state education agency staff from each of the 4 states, really set direction for the network. And then here at Education Northwest, we serve as sort of the backbone, if you will, or the kind of coordinating agency to carry out and operationalize the direction of the steering committee. The other part that we just wanted to highlight is that we're really, we designed this network, we spent a lot of time kind of intentionally designing it up front, and we designed it just enough to get going so that we could really continuously improve it and learn as we go. So we've really embraced this notion of continuous improvement. Now I'll give you kind of a quick look at where where these sites are. This is the lower 48, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So you can see the districts range from the south of both Oregon and Idaho, kind of the southern end, all the way up to the border of Canada, really, in Washington. And we also have Alaska members. So if you look over there, well, Karen is from St. Valley Borough, which is the upper right-hand corner. And then we have a bunch of sites in the lower left-hand side, the western side of Alaska, in the lower Kuskokwim School District. A school district, by the way, a fun factoid, that is geographically about the size of Ohio, and it connects 22 remote villages. So when we use sites and districts interchangeably, it's because that's actually one huge district, but they have the same isolation sort of conditions in their villages, and they kind of are autonomous K-12 systems, so they're part of our network. Okay? So the premise of Northwest RISE, really the challenge we were trying to overcome is that rural educators have limited opportunities to collaborate with rural-like peers to improve practice, which many of you have noted in your chat box here. So we wanted to just squarely hit that. What can we do to address that challenge? So we bring together educators in this network, and they, through routine communication and collaboration, what we're actually doing in the network is sharing resources. That's how some of the initial trust got built, is kind of at the level of sharing resources, ideas, strategies, tools. Now we've gone much deeper in the direction of where we really envision, which is collaboration on joint projects in job-alike groups. So actively working on projects together, sharing student work, et cetera. Our idea is that by networking educators, we will increase, we adopted the notion, Hargreaves and Fulham's notion of professional capital. That is that the educators in the network will have increased social capital. They'll be more connected and have a place to turn to for support. They'll also, as they are connecting with peers, they'll be increasing their human capital, or their access to knowledge, strategies, tools, et cetera. Resulting in increased decisional capital, which is what plays out in the classroom. So making decisions using that knowledge, those strategies, those tools to change their practice and improve their practice, and ultimately getting to those improved outcomes. I had mentioned the student motivation, engagement, community attachment, achievement, et cetera. And we also note that one of our intended outcomes is around the adults who are participating in the network, so teacher, administrator, efficacy, and retention. So that's our premise. We have kind of some fun data. You know, we haven't conducted a lot of rigorous research, and as Nettie mentioned, there's not a ton of research around these networks in the United States, so that's one of our passions, is trying to do a little bit more of that. But we do surveys attached to our outcomes for our network, and from our recent survey, because professional capital is one of our intended outcomes for the educators participating in the network, we analyzed the data around that, and we found, we had a really interesting finding, and that is on the social capital dimension. We found that social capital is actually higher for members who are actively participating in Northwest RISE events, so the in-person convenings, and their job-alike groups, so collaborating between sessions and really engaged in job-alike work together. It's actually a statistically significant difference between their self-ratings of social capital and other colleagues who are less involved in the network. So we think that's pretty exciting preliminary results. The other thing I just want to share with you are these quotes here. We have a lot of qualitative data, we have lots of stories, we have lots of anecdotes, so we wanted to, of course, put a few of these up here. Give me a second just to look at those. One that, you know, stands out to me in particular is in the lower left-hand corner. It just, for me, is what this is network and joining educators together to do awesome work together is all about. And kind of speaks to that challenge that I spoke of. So I am more positive and feel like I can solve issues as they arise, whereas I would have just shrugged my shoulders before. So again, having no one to turn to, the alternative is to just shrug your shoulders, right? So that's what this network's all about, and what we're trying to achieve together. In terms of I told you that the job-alike groups were sort of the cornerstone, I guess, of the network. So I just want to give you a quick overview of a few of the things that job-alike groups are doing as examples, and then Karen will actually give you a lot more specifics from her vantage point in her job-alike. So the secondary math group, a cool thing that they brought to the network that they discovered and have been experimenting with and have actually taught the network at large a lot about is video study. So they've been really zeroed in on videotaping students working together and then using that, sharing those videos from a distance as a way to talk about what's going on with student learning and then therefore what implications might be for their classroom practice, et cetera. So they've really been front runners in bringing that to the network, which has been really powerful. The English Language Arts, the high school English Language Arts job-alike group have been really zeroed in on argumentative writing for years, and they identified this as a pressing need that they both felt was a weakness for their students and felt like they needed more strategies and sort of different ways to approach this as teachers. So they, their most recent project around this, they've just been going deeper and deeper over time, was to do a lyric analysis. So all the students picked a song that represented their life or something that they valued or something like that, and then had to sort of make arguments about why that was and to analyze the lyrics and all that kind of stuff, and then share their writing. This is what the really cool thing is about this group. They were on the forefront of saying, hey, how awesome is it that we have a chance to collaborate now and open up kind of our view as teachers. We're going to bring our classrooms into this. So they were kind of the first group to really grab on that idea of connecting their students, and now that has kind of gone like wildfire, I'm happy to say, throughout the network, and it's really powerful. The last one that I'll talk about is the special education group, which is a relatively new job-alike group that has formed, and what they've been zeroed in on is student self-advocacy and self-determination. So they've taken on this challenge of sort of thinking about how to help students increase their self-advocacy and self-determination. And they're doing two things I think are really cool. One is that they found a measure that they're having students, parents, and themselves use in terms of their observations about where students are on the different dimensions of these. And then they're having students develop their own portfolios and lead their own IEP meetings. And they're all in different places around this. Some started with one student, some said, I'm going to take it on with all of my students. But the point is that they're all taking on something in common and using a common measure, and then have that to come back to and have really powerful conversations about what they're learning and what they can change and improve. So that's just a little bit of insight about a few of our job-alikes, and now I'm going to pass it to Karen, who will talk more from her perspective. Karen, okay. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful.
So my job-alike group is a 3rd through 5th grade group, and some of the, I'm going to tell you a little bit some of the work that we've focused on in the last couple of years, and then how that has benefited us and our students. So last year, one of the main activities that we did, part of our group, was to understand the concept of learned helplessness and understand how that impacted our students' abilities to persevere in problem solving. And what we did is we initiated a book study together that led us to understand the construct of motivation and to question what our students really brought to our classrooms about their beliefs about learning. And what we did was we implemented some growth mindset surveys. We interviewed our students. We had our students do some reflection writing. And then we also video studied ourselves. And in the same process, so this was understanding how we influenced that and what our students believed. And simultaneously, we developed sort of sets of interventions for helping support kids' positive beliefs about learning and growth mindset. And we used those as well and taught our students about how the brain learns. And then this last year, we kind of followed the suit of some other job-alike groups, and we really wanted to focus on connecting our students. And so what we did was we have worked on co-designing learning experiences that engage our students together. And one project is around open-ended, multi-level, accessible math tasks from U-Cubed from Joe Bowler at Stanford, and that allows all of our students at various levels to be able to work together on the mathematical practices of communicating and reasoning or problem solving at different access points, and then we've connected them. You can see in the picture on this slide, this is actual connection of a classroom in Lower Kuskokwim School District and Wishram, Washington, with our 4th, 5th grade classroom in Healy, and they're sharing their problem-solving thinking virtually. And then another project that we've engaged in is right now our students are busily putting together a newspaper product that integrates their studies of our own state's history. And we're bringing that work to our convening in 2 weeks to share with students who have created similar projects from Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. And as a job-alike group, we'll look at that student work together using a protocol from the National School Reform faculty to sort of interrogate student work and what we learned from that. And so some of the benefits that I've listed on this slide is for our students, it has an increased cognitive engagement and emotional engagement in these learning experiences because they know that they're going to share their work with other students outside the building. And we surveyed them and asked them, how this affected their desire to want to problem solve, and all of them it made a difference to know that they were going to connect with peers and actually communicate about math, reasoning, and communication to someone besides their teachers and even their own classmates. And so that it reduces this isolation that they feel and extends learning way beyond the walls of our classroom. And again, that sort of the authentic audience to be able to share not only products, but their learning and their thinking has been a really powerful outcome for connecting our students. So next slide. And then the other piece that is a huge benefit for us is the teacher-to-teacher collaboration, and it's been super powerful to connect with other educators in different rural contexts. We have lots of different demographics represented even in our job-alike groups, even though we're rural isolated school districts, but we have these shared problems that resonate across different contexts. And when we come together and we share about that, we feel this strong connection and relationship to people who really care about the work of education in our classrooms and our students. And then this opportunity to strengthen our own expertise by sharing knowledge and our pedagogical thinking and things directly related to our practice. And so that's been really powerful to increase the concept of teacher collective efficacy even beyond the walls of our school buildings. And I would say that definitely is a benefit and an outcome that we've seen throughout the network with our colleagues in other states and in LKSD. So I'm going to turn the time back to Nettie now.
Thanks, Karen, so much. We had hoped what you all presented was so rich with the convenings and the job-alike groups and the really perceived and experienced benefits of those activities for rural educators and also rural students. And we'd hoped after each presentation to pause for a question and answer in order for us to catch up a little bit because of the technical issues we had earlier. We're going to wait until after, we'll take a pause after Margaret's presentation. Before I turn it over to Margaret, though, I just want Danette and Karen to think about one of the questions that was submitted in the registration process, which is how is it that principals and superintendents and administrators in rural districts, maybe even in service districts or the state level, support this kind of collaboration, going to convenings twice a year, actually taking time to participate in job-alike groups in the meantime. So if you all can think about that question, and then we'll be coming back to you after Margaret has a chance to share about the Vermont Rural Partnership. Margaret, are you there?
Thank you, Nettie. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We sure can. Thank you.
Okay, great. What I'm going to talk about is the Vermont Rural Partnership, and you'll see or hear a lot of parallels between what I'm going to say and what's just been shared around the power of networks. So we were established in 1996, and we are a group of 36 schools, approximately 5,000 students, mostly situated in the northeast part of Vermont, along the Canadian border up north and the New Hampshire border to the east. Over the years, we're a mix of pre-K to 12 schools, pre-K to 8 schools, and pre-K to 6 schools, and we're relatively small schools, as small as 50 students and as large as about 350 students. We've been able to leverage approximately $5 million over the years and distribute it to the schools from multiple sources. And we've found that small schools and districts individually have limited capacity to access funds on their own, and that funders like funding multiple small schools and communities in one grant. And we can act as that go-between. And as a lean organization with very low overhead, we can funnel 95% plus of the resources directly to the schools and communities. Our funds have over the years come from small family foundations. There are a few small family foundations in some of our communities, from Vermont funders, the Vermont Community Foundation, for example, and from regional funders, funders like the Nellie Mae organization, which is based in Boston and New England, has a New England reach, and then for competitively applied for federal funds. We've had some success in attracting large grants from federal funds, such as service learning funds, when they were more readily available, and a number of flow of history grants over the years. So our goals have been to promote student voice engagement and leadership. It's an asset-based approach based from the feeling that rural has value and is an asset, not a deficit, and that students can learn to be a leader from a young age in their community, and that can help them be a leader as they become an adult, wherever they end up, whether that be a rural or urban area. We encourage a lot of place-based learning, community-based learning, interdisciplinary approach, which builds 21st century skills in students. And we've found that strong school-community connections are really important, and that schools and communities can work in synergy for mutual benefit. We also make efforts to tell our story through assessment and documentation of the impact of the work we do. Next slide. So each year we have a cycle of activities that every school participates in, and then we have optional additional activities which some schools choose to participate in. But the activities that everyone participates in are seasonally based. In the fall, we have a principal retreat, usually before school starts, and then we have a meeting of grant teams. And all our meetings, except for the principal's retreat, students participate in. It's not just adults. So teachers and students attend. In the fall, teachers and students who are interested in applying for mini-grants come, and they pitch an idea to other teams, and they get feedback on their idea. They learn about the mini-grant writing process, and then they go away and write mini-grants. In the winter, in the early winter, we meet to peer review the mini-grants, and all our grants are funded, but there's a stage process for that. As we read and discuss the mini-grants and compare them to a criteria list, some grants might be immediately funded. They may meet all the criteria needed. Others may need to have some questions answered, and others may need to have sections beefed up or rewritten. But eventually, everyone's funded, usually by January of the school year, and then activities take place, and in the spring, we have a conference. Usually, more students than adults attend the conference, and at the conference, it's a showcase. So students have a bigger stage at the conference. They're co-presenters with adults of the work they've done, and it's a bigger stage for students who often are in a relatively small world within their school. So mini grants have been funded on a whole variety of things. For example, we've had students serving on town committees, doing traffic studies, naming roads, and explaining the school budget at town meetings. We've had a lot of history and literacy work done, restoring one-room schoolhouses, doing surveys of agricultural buildings in the town, oral histories, writing and illustrating town histories for younger children. We've done a lot of science activities, nature trails, gardening. We've built a number of bread ovens, Quebec bread ovens, which become fundraising tools, so they can be pizza night or they can be bread day where they make bread that's for sale in the community. We've created a lot of natural playscapes in our schools, and we found that many projects end up being multi-year in that a kernel of idea can sometimes be bigger and take longer than teachers first think, and over 3 years they may get to a much bigger end product than they may from their initial idea. So that's been a strength. So the gardening, for example, is often a multi-year project. The bread ovens can be multi-year projects, not just getting the bread oven built, but the curriculum that goes with the bread oven, and then the whole role of food and bread within the community, and the resource that can be within a community. So next slide. So some lessons learned from what we've done. The ERP is a flat organization. We're not service providers. We have a role, but really what we do is facilitate ownership by everyone involved. We empower students, adults of all levels, parents, teachers, to be equal voices in the organization. We try to build ownership in multiple ways. We found that staying connected has been really important, so we encourage both formal and informal connections. For example, schools that are doing similar projects may connect as a subset of schools. We found that pressing issues can often galvanize action. So when there's pressing issues in one place, it's often other places have dealt with that issue or also share that issue, and helping people make that connection and problem solve together, use each other as a resource, don't necessarily rely on outside experts as resources, can be helpful. It helps empower small schools and communities who sometimes have a deficit view of themselves, or when we don't have the resources, or we don't have this, or we're not Burlington, Vermont, for example. And change that mindset to, oh boy, look what we do have. We have wonderfully supportive community members who bring so many assets to our school and who are welcomed at our school. We have, you know, just a different way of looking at it. So over the years, VRP has been able to accomplish a lot. And I think the words of one student, Cara Cookson, she is a student from Cabot School, says it a lot. She said, as a young person, you get a lot of pop culture messages that living in a rural place is less than living in the city, and that rural is a place to leave. So even though I have always been proud of my place and my family, it was important to me to have that idea cemented that rural is important, and that it adds a greater cultural value and a value that is shared. And I got that through participating in the Vermont Rural Partnership. Thank you, Nettie.
Wonderful, Margaret. Thank you so much. When we were working on the case studies of these networks and collaboratives, I was just so struck, Margaret, by how you all have been in operation for over 20 years, which really speaks to the value that you've created to be able to sustain that work over time. And I've been advised to allow Brad to go ahead and start, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. But before Brad does, Margaret, I'd like for you you really spoke nicely to a question that was submitted ahead of time, which has to do with, you know, do you have to purchase expensive curriculum like workbooks? Are there ways that networks or collaboratives can kind of get around that and create rich curriculum that will engage students? And the projects that you described, I think, really fit the bill with that. I think the question is, how do you all, how do the schools in your collaborative kind of align with state standards or other curriculum that may be required, and you know, how does that all work together? So if you wouldn't mind be thinking about that just a little bit, and we'll go ahead and let Brad bring us home with his work in the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative. Brad, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Nettie. And thanks, Nettie, for your fine work here with all the technical difficulties. You're keeping it all together, so I appreciate it. I also appreciate Danette and Karen and Margaret's. I also appreciate Danette, Karen, and Margaret's passion and expertise and stories about rural schools and rural revitalization. It's actually key, I think, to American revitalization. When you think about the rural role in American prosperity, it is significant, whether we're talking about water or food or land or energy security and the future of those things. Those are rural issues. If you talk about the defense of our country, 47% of all military personnel come from rural areas. And so it's always exciting to have a conversation with people about the power and importance of rural life and learning and livelihood as we move forward into the 21st century. I'd like to go back to the original question for this webinar: what response is needed for rural schools and students to thrive? And I'd like to link it to one of the questions that was sent in advance, the last question, which is there such a thing as rural student identity? I actually think those two questions are connected, that if we are truly going to have a positive and broad response for rural schools and students to thrive, we really have to face rural identity. And rural identity is talked about, as Margaret talked about. There sometimes can be an attitude that rural identity is a place to leave rather than a place to achieve. There's often a notion of rural identity as looking backwards, as it used to be, versus looking forward about what could happen in terms of schools and their communities transforming rural economies and rural opportunities for prosperity for all. So I actually think this is an exciting time for rural revitalization. And as you see by the first slide here, the 3 Ps of rural education collaboratives that we've learned from around the country, and again, like Nettie, and I appreciate Nettie's work on the project, I strongly encourage you to download from the site that's been provided the report called Generating Opportunity and Prosperity, the Promise of Rural Education Collaboratives. Behind all the study of the 14 collaboratives, 16 collaboratives that we studied, these 3 Ps kept coming back, and I just kind of want to highlight them and give one example because I think they all deal with identity and deal with a forward-looking perspective on the future of rural schools and the communities. Place-based. If you look at most of these rural education collaboratives, they have a very place-based framework, and that essentially means they help their member schools meet local economic, civic, or social needs that actually foster rural growth and sustainability. When you heard the responses earlier about in Vermont about the project-based learning that helped build rural landscapes and playscapes, when you heard about Karen's talk about authentic assessment and authentic projects in the rural community that actually enhances the rural community and not just provides a connection but an enhancement, that place-based collaboratives are hugely important. That if a collaborative comes in from the outside, it's essentially talking about evidence-based practice or best practices, and don't ground it in place-based values and realities, those collaboratives don't last. And I think the Vermont is a great example. It's one of the longer collaboratives, and its roots are helping member schools meet local economic, civic, or social needs through giving student voice and student projects that are relevant and meaningful for the rural communities that those students live in. So being place-based is hugely important for all these collaboratives. Secondly, it's peer-based, and I think Danette and Karen's Northwest RISE stories are a very good example of peer-based collaboratives. Peer-based collaboratives help member schools overcome geographic and professional isolation of their teacher educators, which ultimately have huge human capital advantages. For example, as Danette talked about, the increase in professional capital and social capital. Rural teachers need each other much more than urban teachers need each other in a certain extent, in terms of their multi-hatted roles and their ability to work across disciplines. So it builds social capital. It also builds human capital in the sense of retaining your talent. For example, the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative that I'm involved in particular, as well as the Colorado Rural Education Collaborative, they've done a lot of work on building local talent and growing your own talent and keeping your own talent. We have found that through peer-based networking, a teacher in District A who becomes a teacher leader and gets involved in the teacher practice network becomes a principal in District B. They may not stay in the same rural district, but they stay in the region and they stay in the rural human capital labor market. And we have found with the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, a lot of our teacher leaders have become principals and have stayed in the area. And so we're actually growing the bench strength as we move forward with providing peer-based networking and teacher practice networks. So it's got to be peer-based, help member schools overcome geographic and professional isolation of their educators. And then third, pedagogy-based, which means helping member schools better understand their students, what their students experience, and how their students can succeed in a global economy even if they decide to stay at home after they graduate. A pedagogy that is rurality-based and reality-based is hugely important, particularly in agricultural areas, in which agricultural education was the first form of STEM education, and the building of local talent and expertise, whether it be agricultural expertise or entrepreneurial expertise to grow the small businesses of tomorrow in rural areas, is very, very important. And so those places that are changing their pedagogy to deal with more with 21st century learning skills, which really are 19th century agrarian skills, which deal with critical thinking and creativity and ingenuity and collaboration and communication. Those places that are moving to pedagogy-based approaches are really helping the rural schools and communities. So those three Ps, I think, are hugely important, and if you read the report, there are a lot of examples around the country, and it's not exhaustive. I know there are Oklahoma people on this call and this webinar. There's a lot of things going on in Oklahoma with collaboratives and other places, but it was a good start, so I recommend the report. Next slide. There we go. Thank you. So quickly in the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, you can see the numbers there. The thing I would want to highlight there is if you think of Ohio, you often think it's an urban-based state, but it's actually the fourth largest rural population state in the country. And if you took all the students from all the collaborative members of the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative and formed one district, it actually would be the second largest school district in the state of Ohio. And that has paid dividends in terms of policy and influence of the OAC members over the last 5 or 6 years, and I'll talk a minute about that. Next slide. So the current focus of the OAC has gone through many iterations because if you're going to be place-based and peer-based and pedagogy-based, you got to change with the times and change with the people and change with the rural communities and where they're going. But right now, the OAC is focused on having a shared dual enrollment system, largely in those 4 pathways that you see at the bottom of the slide: arts and communication, business and entrepreneurship, health and human services, science, technology, engineering, and math, to essentially try to grow local talent for a local economy, but also kids can go anywhere with these kind of pathways as well. And so our districts have developed a shared dual enrollment system in which a kid can take an online course or a long-distance course at another district that ties to one of these pathways. If a district doesn't have expertise in that pathway, they go to another district that does, and so it's blue ocean in the sense that we're not robbing teachers and we're not robbing students with teachers. It's a system that serves all places because we go with each participating district's pathway strength, and you develop a shared professional learning community for educators to do that. Quick story on this that I think plays to a couple of the other questions that we got in advance. One, we got a question about what is the impact of regional college and career academies and community colleges and college for rural students, as well as how can you do systemic change in rural opportunities. So I'll give you a good example here on a dual enrollment system. So for years, these individual small rural Ohio districts would go up against their local community college or their local 4-year college and say, we'd like a deal. We'd like to be able to teach our own full enrollment courses by our own teachers, and that we want to either have that at a no credit cost or a very limited student credit cost, because we're carrying most of the burden from paying for the textbooks to paying for the teachers to doing the curriculum and everything in between. And for years, most of the higher education institutions in Southeast Ohio would not play because of their own economic self-interest, which is completely understandable to a certain extent. And so by coming into the collaborative, what we did is we went to, as a collaborative of 48,000 students, and we went back to these places and we said, if we do our own dual enrollment system with our own dual enrollment courses taught on our campuses initially by our teachers, this is what you'll get in return. You're going to get far more rural kids going to your places because Ohio has a budget system based upon success measures. Our kids are going to be better prepared and more likely. So one, you're going to get more kids going to your place. Two, they're more likely to stay and not need remediation. And three, you're likely to win on your budget games by this kind of approach. By laying that out and then actually studying it and showing that at the end of the first and second year of dual enrollment that most of the students performed better on high school-based dual enrollment courses than they did on the college-based dual enrollment courses. They had higher passage rates, and they were more likely to take more college-based courses. That's a great story of place-based plus peer-based plus pedagogy-based, because when they all came together, it was a dual enrollment system that fit the different districts in terms of what pathways they could offer. It was peer-based, in which we credentialed together over 200 high school teachers over a 4-year period of time to be eligible to do dual enrollment courses through peer-based networks and accelerated licensure, credentialing on that. And it was pedagogy-based in that dual enrollment courses tied to these pathways were able to deal with 21st century learning skills like critical thinking, communications, creativity, and collaboration. And so it was a very powerful way to use a collaborative to make the game in your favor. Next slide. So the 3 duh lessons, which are not surprising. Lasting change comes from within. The other 2 presentations were on that. Each participation gets more than they give. This is a big thing. A give-get ratio is always important anywhere, but particularly with rural places that don't have a lot of extra resources, if any extra resources, and leaders having multi-hats. Folks got to know that if they participate in a collaborative, they're going to get out of it more than they give, which is kind of the classic rural co-op that we had with utility and electricity in the earlier part of the 20th century, as well as the agrarian co-ops from the 17th century moving forward. There's got to be a strong give-kit value proposition for this work. And ultimately, trust is the currency that matters most, particularly if you're an outside group that is coming in as either at a university or a private think tank. You've really got to develop strong relationships, and I think Northwest RISE is a particularly good example of being able to do that. Next slide. And so the thing I would like to highlight here is the bottom right-hand quadrant. Yes?
Yeah, if you're going to highlight one quadrant, that would be awesome, so we could leave just a few minutes for questions for our participants. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's why I decided to do it. So there's a National Rural Forum that takes place every October. Next year it's going to be in Denver, Colorado. If you Google National Forum for the Advancement of Rural Education, you can learn about it. A lot of the rural collaboratives that are on the report come to this forum and give you a chance to participate with that National Rural Collaborative group. Last thing I want to share is John Andes, who's one of the directors from one of the collaboratives, the Maryland Eastern Shore Collaborative, had a great quote that I like to end on when they talk about why do people come to your collaboratives, and he said, most folks come for therapy, some come for answers, and some come for both. And I think really that's at the end of the day what all these collaboratives do, is they allow you to therapeutically engage in these tough rural challenges, but also find solutions together, because ultimately collaboration provides choice. And in a choice-based age in rural areas, collaboration is a key pathway to educational choice. Thanks, Nettie.
Wow. Brad, thank you so much. We could not have had a better presenter to run our anchor leg of our 3 presentations. And at this time, because we are going until quarter after the hour, whatever hour you are, across the country. We have a few minutes for questions, and so I'm going to, give you all a minute or so while I'm asking these questions that I've been keeping on my list for you all to answer some questions or offer some questions in the Q&A box on your screen. And if we don't get to all of them, then we will be sure and post some answers, or you all can certainly feel free to contact us directly or any of the presenters with your questions. So we have about 6 minutes left. All of you, Danette and Karen and Margaret and Brad offered such rich information about your networks and collaboratives, and I want to go back to that question about administrative support. How is it that administrators can really support teachers who are stretched, who are probably wearing, 2 or 3 different hats, and to participate in a network or a collaborative?
Yeah, I'll start, and then if Karen wants to add here or any of the others, I think this is so foundational. We designed the network, actually Northwest RISE, with this dimension in mind. We really wanted the core of it to be teachers working with teachers in sort of cross-district PLCs, and we recognize that the success of that and sort of the sustainability of that kind of community really depended a lot on getting support from administrators. So we require administrators to be a part of the network and be working right alongside of teachers. They also have their own peer groups. A lot of their focus during the network activities are how can we support teachers to be successful with this collaborative work. We also have state education agency staff doing the same thing. So we have kind of a nested approach. I would say, how can you support teachers kind of at a local level of collaborating with districts? I'd say reach out to a neighbor. We've had a lot of our members say, gosh, it's amazing that this big geographically spread network, it took that for us to figure out, boy, we should connect more with districts that are relatively close to us, even if they're an hour or 2 away. So we have lots of our districts actually forming kind of local level kind of affiliates and really reaching out to each other, sharing PD resources, doing book studies, et cetera. The other suggestion I would have, I'd say, so reach out. Think about creative scheduling so that teachers can have this time and space to go meet with each other in person. Trust building is so important. And then I would say the third part that I would just highlight is to be in it, to be really in it with teachers is so important, to be sitting dedicated, learning with their peers, et cetera. So kind of being in it with them.
Terrific. Thank you, Danette. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in from participants. So Margaret, if you don't mind holding your response to the question that I gave you earlier. So there was a question about teacher and administrator prep programs and whether there is a role for teacher administrator preparation, university-based, college-based programs in this work. And I'm wondering if either Brad or Margaret would like to speak to that, or Karen?
This is Brad. I'll take a quick thing on it because I think it's a little different thing. Obviously, teacher-educator shortages are huge, and there's a lot of things going on around the country. But a twist that I think is growing that I think people should look into is research practice partnerships, in which higher education partners with rural districts and they can use their student teachers or their apprentice principals as kind of researchers in the rural schools to help look at new innovations, test them out, and see if they work. And with ESSA going to state level and with evidence-based practice, rural places are going to have dilemmas being able to compete for competitive rural dollars. And many states in their ESSA plans are going to competitive school improvement dollars. And so having higher education, either through the teacher prep programs or just the general research programs, connect with rural districts, I think is going to be a very, very important thing. So that's just a small, unique approach to that question.
All right, fantastic. Well, we have one more minute left, and we are obligated and committed to ending on time and respecting everyone's time. I regret that we weren't able to address all of the questions. However, up on this slide, as you see, are the links to all of the networks and collaboratives that were presented today, as well as REL Northwest. And we really encourage you all to keep this conversation going. Send us some questions. We'll respond. And in a few weeks, we'll be posting all of the resources and materials on the REL Northwest site. So at this time, I want to thank all of our presenters for wonderful, in-depth, and rich presentations of your work. I want to thank all of the participants for your questions and for participating today and your interest in this work. Encourage everyone to check out the Battelle for Kids report that is linked on slides in this presentation, Generating Opportunity and Prosperity, the Promise of Regional Education Collaboratives. And please let us know how we did by sending me an email, which is right up there. And everyone, have a wonderful day. Hope you enjoy the fall and keep this conversation going. Thank you.